This is Judge Joe Brown, and we're listening to We All Be News. News-free Dixie for the 21st century.
Unless the body politic that you are part of is willing to commit all of its resources to winning the war. If they're not, you have no business being there, because war is but the ultimate political tool. War is but a continuation of the political process. So if there are no viable politics that are involved, you don't need to get extreme and go to war for something that is not politically viable. The question must be asked, if you are not defending yourself from outside aggression, what do you have to get out of fighting this particular war? And if you can't answer that question, you don't need to be there. If you find that you're not able to put all of your country's resources into fighting that war, the country doesn't need to be involved. And then it cautions you, that's Clausewitz. He says, remember, you may win the war, win all the battles, achieve the territorial gains you seek, but get turned out of office by your people back home, which is exactly what happened here in the 60s.
So we won every battle in Vietnam, right? From a military point of view.
No, we didn't.
We didn't win.
You see, the bottom line is you fight a battle for an objective. All they were doing was dealing with body count, but the true point of it is in a war, you're trying to deal with territory. And the only way to secure the territory is basically exterminate everybody. And that includes your allies that you're supposed to be there to protect and advance. So you couldn't do that. So what are you there for? There are no politically viable objectives to achieve.
It's like kind of like the Revolutionary War, where the British actually won more battles, but they still lost the war because of the price they paid, right? As far as resources and men, they paid a price for a huge price for those victories in battle. Or you think that's not the case?
They usually leave this out.
Okay.
The time our Revolutionary War was going on, there was a guy named Napoleon Bonaparte that was kind of occupying the attention of the Brits while all this was happening. Fighting Napoleon, and before him, the French Revolution is a little bit much for a country that has gone broke. You know why they're broke?
Wow.
It's hooked up with today. The last strong emperor of China demanded gold bullion in payment for tea. The British had developed a craving for tea. You know, I say, old fellow, the sport of tea here. And tea and sugar came in, tea from Asia, sugar from America. And by the time they got through paying gold bullion, the Royal Treasury and the British Treasury was bankrupt almost. So they couldn't afford to continue the Revolutionary War. Now, where does that bring us to today? Well, Great Britain, the U.S., France, Italy, and then Japan, in their quest for tea, decided to use Afghanistan, which was then known as northern India, to produce opium. They took the opium to China, deliberately engaged in a widespread campaign to addict the Chinese population to opium dens, dens of iniquity. Sufficiently addicted, they sold opium to them for gold, handed the gold right back for tea. There was that triangular tea, which was opium, tea, and money to grow the opium, and the clipper ships, like Kai-shek, Cutty Sark, Flying Cloud, the American Clipper ships. That's all about drug money being used to buy tea and sinking it back in and doing that triangular trade. When Mao Zedong took over the People's Republic of China in 1950, he finally ejected the American interest, and Chiang Kai-shek, being supported by the Americans, had guaranteed Western powers that they would be allowed to continue the trade of opium for tea. Mao said, no way, no how. So our country, as late as 1950, was involved in the opium trade in what's now Afghanistan. So for 200 years, the Brits and the Americans propped up one drug lord over another. And when they found that the person was too strong, they'd tear him down, which is why they had to have the Taliban, because everything was so fragmented thanks to the U.S. and Great Britain and their craving for tea. They needed a coalition because there was nobody that could assert order. And by the way, May 2001, the Bush administration, on an executive order, gave the Taliban $45 million in military aid as basically a bribe so that Halliburton could get the pipeline rights in Afghanistan, which they still don't have. They got the oil exploitation rights in Iraq, which Halliburton was bidding on, but Hussein gave the contract to the French and the Russians. The weapons of mass destruction, oh yeah, it's just we want oil, and the Bush family owns Halliburton along with the Walker family. See, George Herbert Walker, aka Uncle Herbie to George Herbert Walker Bush, President Bush I founded Halliburton in 1946. So Halliburton is a Bush family, and Cheney is not the one that had Bush as a flunky. Cheney was just a flunky for the Bush-Walker family. You talk about something interesting. The Bush family had a holding company known as Zapata Offshore Oil that was chartered in Kuwait. Now, when Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990 and nationalized everything, the Bush family was destitute. So did we fight a war to restore democracy or to get the Bush family fortune back? Interesting enough, the reason there was a Kuwait in the first place is the Royal Navy screwed up on the design of most of its ships in the Navy, Royal Navy, and Winston Churchill sent a person that was the subject of the movie Lawrence of Arabia to go find some place that was oil rich that the British could take. So in 1922, British Parliament authorized the use of the Marines to go in and seize the southern tip of Iraq and split it off into a puppet government in Kuwait, and they chartered what's now British Petroleum and bought up a big chunk of stock in it so that they could exploit the oil. So there were a lot of Iraqis who remembered when in their lifetimes Kuwait was a part of their country. It's an interesting thing when you get back into what goes around comes around, and you ought to study history to see how it may explain why you're in a mess right now. We're giving up all of these rights thanks to 9/11 when 3,000 people died. Hell, that many died in the first few hours up here at Shiloh. Gettysburg, there were 50,000 dead, and even as late as World War II. The Glamour Force, the Army Air Force, just in the 8th Air Force for B-17, B-24 crews, there were 52,000 dead American airmen within 14 months. 52,000 also dead American soldiers in Vietnam. You see, you lost how many people on Omaha Beach? 9,000, 14,000 casualties, 4,000 dead in several hours. On Utah Beach, the toll was a little less. You talk about the Battle of the Bulge, hell, there were 44,000 fatalities at the Battle of the Bulge, American fatalities, and 96,000 total casualties. So, you know, I think about it, my old man was there. But when you think about that kind of casualty count, and then you talk about 3,000, which is minor in the scheme of things in this country's history, it's awful hard to say we, in the name of being safe, need to give up all of these rights that so many have died, bled, been mutilated, sacrificed, stood up for us to have, when you got a scant 3,000. That's acceptable collateral damage to maintain freedom and liberty.
I know I was thinking about what you said about the opium trade, and I was thinking about the fact that President Franklin Roosevelt family, his grandfather Warren Delano Jr., he made his money through the opium trade. I mean, it made their family fortune, so he's the real American gangster.
Yeah, and then the other one is
John Kerry?
No, Teddy Roosevelt.
Teddy Roosevelt.
They're named Teddy Bears after.
Yeah.
Rough Riders.
That's right.
Well, Teddy Bear was an avowed racist, and his favorite uncle was a Confederate magnate, and he never did get repatriated. He refused to take the oath, and he had to sneak back into America over the years from the Civil War until he died.
Right.
So we had a Johnny Reb sympathizer, who, by the way, had his color sergeant take the Cuban flag that the 10th Cavalry captured on San Juan Hill away from the Buffalo Soldier sergeant at gunpoint.
Wow. But it was the Buffalo Soldiers that saved his life on San Juan Hill. They led the charge.
Well, they captured the hill.
Right.
They were professional soldiers. Mm-hmm. The Rough Riders were nothing but a collection of amateurs, wannabes.
You know, I think like people understand what a white supremacist look like. I always said study Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah.
So here's a guy who betrayed the black trust time and time again. He invited Booker T. Washington to the White House to eat with him and his wife and oldest daughter. And then he got the backlash from the South. But also, when the Brownsville thing happened with the black troops down in Brownsville, Texas, he basically betrayed them. And one of the black officers helped him.
Well, see, that was because the blacks were getting lynched. By the way, do you know that more Buffalo soldiers in the 19th century lost their lives to being lynched by the Texas Rangers than they did to being killed by the Native Americans?
I had no idea about that. Wow.
Now, see, that's the background statistic.